Let me start with a couple of points before we get back into this text. A couple of different times now I've had conversations with some of you who have wanted to characterize the law of hospitality as a natural law. Let's have a conversation about it to make sure that we understand that is exactly what Derrida says it's not. On page 79, this is one place. He says it at least one more place. Somewhere. Let's say it. Is it 79? Oh, 77, sorry. Yeah, down toward the bottom of 77. That is definitely where this aporia is, an antinomy. It is in fact about the law, nomos. This conflict does not oppose a law to nature or an empirical fact. It marks the collision between two laws, at the frontier between two regimes of law, both of them non-empirical. The antinomy of hospitality irreconcilably opposes the law in its universal singularity to a plurality that is not only a dispersal, laws in the plural, but a structured multiplicity, determined by a process of division and differentiation, etc., etc. So this law is not a natural law, which means, for one thing, that it does not and cannot come down to biology, right? We're not simply talking about evolutionary biology or an empirical fact. So where does the imperative come from? Right? Where does the imperative come from? It has to be relational. It would have to be relational. So we might say provisionally, it's not a natural law, it's a relational law. But it's not a natural law, and the reason he wants to make this clear is precisely because this doesn't come down to like the argument between Darwin and Heidegger, right? Where Heidegger wants to make sure that we don't define man simply, the human does not come down to biology, right? That what makes the human life, and for Heidegger it's only a human life, what makes it valuable has everything to do with its relation to being, its relation to being, and not its biological makeup or genetic makeup. Of course, it's just as problematic to ditch science and any scientific insights as it is to ditch philosophy, right? There's got to be some kind of... But in any case, it does not come down to nature. It's not nature as opposed to culture that we're talking about. You gave me a weird squint. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I'm also nearsighted.
Oh.
Thanks for pointing it out.
My apologies. I thought you wanted to say something.
It's not biology. Sometimes it comes down to
Sometimes
biology.
it
Yes.
Sometimes it does. So does this make sense? Yeah. Okay. And second, and Derrida also makes this clear, that hospitality, the law of hospitality, does not come down to a duty, even in the Kantian sense. So let's go to 83. Actually, one page back. Let's go to 81 at the bottom. Here's where he wants to differentiate between the categorical and imperative. In parentheses, let us know, parenthetically, as a quasi-synonym for unconditional, the Kantian expression of categorical imperative is not unproblematic. We will keep it with some reservations, under erasure, if you like, under epithet. For to be what it must be, hospitality must not pay a debt or be governed by a duty. It's gracious and must not open itself to the guest, invited, or visitor, either conforming to duty or even, to use a Kantian distinction again, out of duty. This unconditional law of hospitality, if such a thing is thinkable, would then be a law without imperative, without order, without duty. A law without law, in short. For if I practice hospitality out of duty, and not only in conforming with duty, that's a Kantian distinction, this hospitality of paying up is no longer an absolute hospitality. It's no longer graciously offered beyond debt and economy, offered to the other, a hospitality invented for the singularity of the new arrival of the unexpected visitor. So a law without a law without imperative in the usual sense, and a law without duty. Again, it's a relational law, right? We might say provisionally. But once again, when we say relational, we're not necessarily talking about a subjective relation, a relation between two constituted subjects, but rather a relation that would constitute subjectivity, a relation out of which a subject might emerge. Okay, let's see, so we stopped around the discussion of the family name. So let's go to 25. This is actually another one of these pages that just needs to be read so we can pick it apart. Who wants to read page 25, starting with that first full sentence? Is anyone awake enough? Okay, Nicole.
Because hospitality in this situation is not offered to an anonymous new arrival, and someone who is neither name, nor patronym, nor family, nor social status, and who is therefore treated not as a foreigner, but as another barbarian. We have alluded to this, the difference. One of the subtle and sometimes ungraspable differences between the foreigner and the absolute other is that the latter cannot have a name or a family name. The absolute or unconditional hospitality I would like to offer him or her presupposes a break with hospitality in the ordinary sense, with conditional hospitality, with the right to or a pact of hospitality. In saying this once more, we are taking account of an irreducible pervertibility, the law of hospitality. The express law that governs the general concept of hospitality appears as a paradoxical law, pervertible or perverting. It seems to dictate that absolute hospitality should break with the law of hospitality's right or duty, with the pact of hospitality. To put it in different terms, absolute hospitality requires that I open up my home and that I give not only to the foreigner, provided with a family name, with the social status of being a foreigner, etc., but to the absolute, unknown, anonymous other, and that I give place to them, that I let them come and that I let them arrive and take them in the place I offer them, without asking of them either reciprocity, entering into a pact, or even their names. The law of absolute hospitality commands a break with hospitality by right, with law or justice as rights. Just hospitality breaks with hospitality by right, not that it condemns or is opposed to it, and it can, on the contrary, set and maintain it in a perpetual progressive movement, but it is as strangely heterogeneous to it as justice is heterogeneous to the law, to which it is yet so close, from which in truth it is indissociable.
Thank you. Okay, so there's a lot going on here. First of all, the subtle distinction, sometimes subtle, between what goes by the name the foreigner and the absolute other comes down to the name. Name. Why? Why does it come down to the name?
They can be
What?
located.
Yeah, okay. Why would the absolute other, why would it not be necessary for the absolute other to not have a name?
Because the absolute other doesn't have a place. So if names are like rigid designators, they literally create places. Regardless of where you go, there's a space in the symbolic sort of economy for you. Whereas the absolute other, the barbarian, by definition doesn't even have language, it just goes bar, 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 bar. Which we attribute to the Greeks and Herodotus and produce the Egyptians.
Okay, on one level, absolutely. There's one level, there are a couple of levels here.
But the name is also the location of the consequences for being inhospitable. It makes how you treat someone somewhat trackable and exportable to a clan structure. I mean, if you're not from Athens, but I know you're from Thebes, I mean, wars have been started in this way, where you sort of, leave the prince out overnight in the mud or something, or you leave the angels out in the forest without any young girls to hang out with. Like, it starts fights, and it becomes a kind of
What starts fights? I lost you.
Not being hospitable to people
Oh.
who have a kind of legibility that isn't local, but is still legible in those terms. I mean, if you're truly, a man on an island, they probably could treat you however they wanted to. It wouldn't be a relational consequence, because the family proves that the subject has other relations other than you. You risk those consequences when you're inhospitable to them.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I was reading this as this is the relational imperative. This is the person that, I say person, but this is a relation that has no subjectivity yet.
It's also the economy. There's a social economy that by not having a name, you're excluded from the social economy, and so you're not playing the same currency, basically.
Right, which is sort of what Nick is
Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, one of the things he asks later on, point blank, is what does it mean to be coming from abroad? And in a very literal way, what does it mean to come from abroad, right? From overseas, right? You come from another land. But on another level, which is kind of what Jared was pointing to, there's also the absolute other that can come to you from the place that has been named and make it uncanny again. So that the absolute other, you can encounter the absolute other when in conversation with an old friend, a lover, mom or dad. That absolute other can come from abroad right there in your face, in the company of someone that you know very well. That someone that you know very well has a name. You identify. He or she has been identified, and you identify. And yet, that identity doesn't account for everything you're encountering there. Something comes from abroad, right there, in your living room, over a dinner table. experience where you're like you're having dinner with someone that you absolutely love, even better with a lover, and forever you've known this person. This is an identifiable other, your intimate other. And something can happen, it doesn't matter what it is, it could be a gesture, something that gets said, whatever, and suddenly you're like, and this is important, this is your question, who are you? And that's what Derrida's saying. The question is, once again, as you encounter it, who are you? And you have to know it, right? It's like, oh my God, and why do you ask that question? Because you've just been put into question. I can't assimilate that, right? I'm not predisposed to assimilate that. Okay. So I want to make sure we understand that the absolute other, could be encountered in an engagement with your best friend or with a foreigner. But what we call the foreigner is not the absolute other. The foreigner is an identifiable subject with a name who has obligations, a subject under the law, right? And what hospitality in the strictest sense would require to be hospitality would be hospitality to that absolute other. Absolute unconditional hospitality. Come in.
Diane?
Yes.
I was just wondering, could you encounter the absolute other in yourself? Okay.
Sure.
It's also
Sure. And that is in fact what happens when you encounter an absolute other.
Yeah. Okay.
Suddenly the internal alterity
Okay.
rustles. Right. And what that and that means that which that in the face of which cognition falters. What cognition can't get a grip on. And there's an internal alterity that refuses appropriation. Because you too can be another for the other. Yeah. I'm learning this look.
No, should be. I just think, is this like a universal scenario, or is it specifically like an Algeria thing? Because I feel like a lot of the subtext of this book and hospitality and knowing people, what we pretend we don't know who they are. In France, Derrida, all people. It's kind of an Algerian metaphor, and I wonder if other people can have hospitality, or is it more of a more polite way to discuss a kind of politics? Does that make sense?
Keep talking, I'm not following you.
Actually, that might take me. It's like is this something that is hospitality something that's universally legible for other people outside of some of the context that inspired this book? Is that a clearer question?
Well, that's an interesting way to put it, universally legible. One of the things Derrida does is try to make somewhat articulatable, sort of previously unarticulated distinctions, right?
But are those distinctions, folks who aren't involved in the immediate context can make sense of?
Well, what he's doing is trying to demonstrate how anything called hospitality, be it the laws of hospitality, the duties of hospitality, would make any sense at all, right? That he's suggesting that, in fact, what we call the laws of hospitality, which are not simply Algerian or French or whatever, make any sense, how they're inspired. And once again, if they were only about conditional limits, if they were inspired by precisely what they are, with all the conditions and limits, then they would simply be utilitarian, right? They would just be called laws and duties. They would have nothing to do with something that's supposed to be more than that, right? So he's trying to sort of pull that apart. And this is just, he does it with hospitality, he does it with several, he does it with the gift, right? He's going to do it with forgiveness, right? So in that, I mean, for some reason I'm having a hard time with the language universally legible. It's probably fine, but I'm registering a resistance to it. But provisionally I would say yes, I think so. Yeah.
Sure.
Do you understand why I'm making
I do,
this?
yeah, no,
I don't know how else to say it.
I would say that
Yeah.
that seems like a nice answer. And there's no wrong answer. It's really just, I don't know. Do you think you're hospitable in your life? And
Well, that's
I mean, outside of
obviously
the ethics, I mean, I wouldn't accuse you of being inhospitable, but I mean, do you
that's obviously a very different question, though, right? That's a very different question. Do you think you're hospitable? Because I would
or
say
capable of hospitality?
if you're, but you see what you're doing here. Are you asking a subject if she's capable of hospitality? Because that's not what he's suggesting.
I know, I'm asking any subject outside of the potential context of the book. Like, I mean, if
Nick,
mhm.
this hospitality, according to him, would be what enables a subject to be to begin with. Okay? So that's why I'm having trouble with the, is a subject capable? No, it's what enables a subject to begin with, right? So that, I mean, what am I capable of? I'm capable, perhaps, in terms of capacity, of keeping these laws and duties, right? Maybe, if I want to. That would be whether I want to or not, right? It would come, laws and duties of hospitality would come under the scope of a subject. And that's why, once again, he asks, does a subject give hospitality to another subject, or is it rendered, given up, right, in a way that would precede any distinction between subject and object, etc. Right? Is a subject, and if you're a subject is already inscribed in law, in society, etc. Right? That's part of what a subject is, in language, right? From there, is a subject capable of unconditional hospitality? That's what he's trying to suggest. How could you be? The best you can do, and this is where what he says is justice, right, is to try to straddle, to find intermediate schemas, where he's borrowing again Kantian language that doesn't really work, right? But it's the best, you know, the language fails in front of this task. So the best justice can offer is a perjury of itself in an attempt to perfect itself.
Since this is a very practical question, Nick, my question to you would be, is this completely non-resonant with your daily life?
Well, I think a part of it might be within, being a subject, and not all beings are subjects. We could find examples, but in a moment I would argue that most people are legible to some sort of legal structure these days. This happens. Is it resonant for me personally? I guess I haven't really thought about it. Do I think that...
It seems to not fit your intuition.
I feel like it would fit my intuition a lot more if it resonates. I'm still sort of waiting for the other shoe to drop, to say, oh wait, I am really hospitable. That happens all the time, that kind of thing. But I'm still waiting.
Do you feel affected?
Do I feel
Do you feel affected by other people, other relations?
We
Do
found
you
a
think,
sociopath.
you think you're kind of a, because let me just suggest that,
Every single one of you.
let me just suggest that It actually doesn't matter if you feel affected or not.
That's
Right. Yeah. But the very fact that you're wearing a jacket, for example, indicates that you are. You're not impervious. You're open. You're exposed.
You're not a closed bubble.
Just trying to fit in.
You're just trying to fit in. Everybody else is wearing jackets.
Just to
and
eat all of you for lunch.
Even the idea that you would try to fit in. Right. Okay. So let me go back and make sure we understand. There is nothing touchy-feely about this book. It's a very troubling kind of book, and I would also say Derrida is one of the first people to point out that there's nothing touchy-feely about Levinas either. Levinas is not all, ooh, community is so sweet. No. Relations are persecutions, right? The other is the persecutor, which is also not necessarily bad. It's where all our hope comes from. But nonetheless, there's nothing touchy-feely here. And what he's bumping up against, and what he's trying to help us encounter, is the sort of impossibility of being a self-sufficient subject. An impossibility of being self-sufficient or detached. The fact that the best you can do ever is respond. You don't get to be an original thinker. You don't get to be, the absolute rebel. Even the absolute rebel is in a response mode. You're in response-only mode, and that's as good as it gets. And that's not bad. It's just another, you have to extract yourself from a kind of, even if rebellious, very traditional way of thinking about being a subject. Being a subject, very first of all, means you are subjected, and not simply to language, or tradition, or laws, but to others. And that's not something that you just deal with, it's something that makes you be. That would have to be the starting point of any contemplation of what he's asking you to contemplate. Okay, let's pick up one other thing on this page. Down at the very bottom, a just hospitality. Okay. So the law of absolute hospitality commands a break with hospitality by right, with law or justice as rights. Just hospitality breaks with hospitality by right. Not that it condemns or opposes it. Once again, we're encountering this. This antinomy is not an opposition. That is, let me fill in the antecedents to all these pronouns. Just hospitality breaks with hospitality by right. Not that just hospitality condemns or is opposed to hospitality by right. And just hospitality can, on the contrary, set and maintain hospitality by right in a perpetual progressive movement. But just hospitality is as strangely heterogeneous to hospitality by right as justice is heterogeneous to the law, to which it is yet so close, from which, in truth, it is indissociable. What's the difference between law and justice?
Well, justice would be the straddling of the two.
Okay, but give me an example of some enactment of law that you would find unjust?
Condemning it is a man's act.
Okay. Right. Legal? Yes. Just? What else? That's an extreme one.
Condemning a guilty person to death.
There you go. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. What else? I mean, it's so prevalent. It depends on your particular perceptions of things, but let's just say not allowing a gay couple to marry. That's not legal, right? Or let's say allowing a couple to marry. Why does it have to be legal? Is that just for law to step in? You see what I'm saying? It can be much more everyday than even about a life or a death. But surely I'm not projecting this. You experience this all the time.
That feeling of injustice.
That feeling of injustice in the law. The law is not in itself just, right? Well, it justifies itself in its own way, but it's not justice.
Could you be condemned to live?
Aren't we all?
That's what I'm trying to think.
I think that's what Simon was saying. Right. It's just better to die. Yeah. Well, actually, you know what? You know who just died? Kevorkian.
Oh,
Right, and he was arguing basically that these people are being condemned to live, right? So that's what, yeah.
No, please.
Well, I mean, on the idea, can you be condemned to live? I have a friend who, at 35, she just died from cancer. She got a diagnosis October 1st, she died in February. She showed up in a hospice, and your point of entry is the emergency room,
Yeah.
where they start sticking you with needles and trying to determine your blood pressure, try to stabilize, but she'd already decided, I can't fight this, it's
Right,
I'm
so
done.
stop it.
It's a hospice, but it's gonna happen.
but it's the doorway to the hospice, you go
You
through
have
the
to go
emergency
into,
room.
yeah.
what about the woman who a couple years back, I can't remember her name, where it was all the legal, everyone was stepping in to keep her alive.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so, by law you can be condemned to live. Yeah, that's in a way even worse.
Isn't it awful?
Yeah.
Well, that's where some of our resonance with Venner, I mean, that's perhaps the first natural law, is that you can't destroy yourself. That was the first natural law we get in Leviathan, is you, by natural law, you can't destroy yourself. But I wanted to speak to justice versus law for a second, because just, I mean, it's kind of like a one-off little side remark he makes, right? But it seems like, to me, it's useful in clarifying it, just insofar as justice would be absolutely singular all the time, every time, whereas law is, by definition, not about anybody in particular. So if I show up at a traffic light at midnight, and I've had this experience in Stuttgart, I mean, the way people obey traffic signals is very different. As a pedestrian, and I don't have a walk sign, I actually can't legally cross the road.
Right.
If I can look down the street and see no cars in either direction for half a mile, but I can't legally cross the road. It's not just, obviously, because it has nothing to do with me. Justice would surely have something to do with the particularity of experience there.
Right.
And the law has just to do with the concept of a person in such a situation.
But, and this is the point he's trying to make, law, okay, I'm hesitating over something I'm about to say, but I'm going to just plunge through, and then we'll complicate it. The law also has everything to do with justice. It's supposed to be a function of justice. The experience of justice, or let's say injustice, is supposed to be what allows us to change the law. And the laws of the land are supposed to be perfectible. That doesn't mean they're ever going to be perfect. It's not. This is an activity with no end. Right.
But you're kind of mean a justice with a capital J there. There's this, I mean, similar to there's the law, the capital L. I mean, it's a much larger thing that we can't necessarily directly access. with these malleable laws.
But we
With the
see
lowercase.
it, right, all the time. Like, you know, when enough people get pissed off enough about the injustice of, let's say, don't ask, don't tell, then finally, the way the system, such as it is, begins to work, finally, the laws begin to change, right? That's the idea. And that's why law is connected to justice. It's supposed to be an enactment of justice. And of course, I mean, we don't want to live without laws, right? But at the same time, laws are can be our biggest enemy, right? And so you fight them all the time. You fight with them all the time, and yet you want them, you need them. But the idea is that once law is dissociable from justice, then you've got you've got plenty of political setups, right, that one would try to escape. But even in a monarchy, there's a claim that the law comes from on high, through me to you. Right? There's a claim of justice, but in any case, laws, as we experience them in let's say, particularly democratic societies. I have all kinds, red flags are shooting up, but okay, I'm not are supposed to be indissociable from justice, and that's supposed to be the way the system works. The system is defined that way, so that your experience of injustice can in fact end up affecting the structure of law. Okay, so that connection is the one he's trying to make between hospitality and hospitality. The law and the laws. They're absolutely heterogeneous, and yet they're indissociable. Yeah.
A couple of quick questions. So when he says just hospitality, does he actually mean absolute hospitality, or is he creating a third kind of more nuanced distinction?
Just hospitality, then. A just hospitality. Let's read what he says again. Just hospitality breaks with hospitality by right. It's not opposed to hospitality right, but it breaks with it. It's stuck to it and affected by it, but breaks with it. Just hospitality would be, now I forget where it talks about the straddling, but just hospitality would be a hospitality, once again, yes, that straddles the law and the laws of hospitality. A just hospitality is not the same as the laws of hospitality.
Right, but it's also not the same as
It's not,
absolute.
right, absolute hospitality would not be just hospitality either, right?
So I guess corollary to that, for Derrida, what is the structure of justice? Like, how do we come to an impulse of justice? So I mean, he describes pretty well, this kind of impulse to absolute hospitality, as kind of the kind of possibility of being subject. That seems pretty clear. But what creates this affect of injustice? What creates this impulse that was unjust?
Mm-hmm. Well, he's not spelling it out here.
Sure.
Though, let me just say, you're all going into a class where you will be talking about this in particular, and it's hard. Right? Sure. So what are y'all reading in there? You're reading Just Gaming,
The
Differend,
and,
A little bit more
and okay, that's very different. But okay. Just Gaming is one of the things that, one of the pieces where you're going to focus specifically on justice. So you'll get some of that there. And there's a lot of overlap between Derrida's presumptions about justice here and what Leotard says about them there in terms of being drawn, unsystematizable, and drawn from singular situations in the moment each time. The idea of justice.
But so it's still relational.
Oh yeah, it would have to be relational,
Right.
situational and relational.
After the all these way too grounded foundation words, but after that sort of subjectivity has already taken place after this absolute hospitality, this openness. So I guess it's a set of relations on another level, maybe. Then
Well, it's a, and we're also going to talk about this again, but let's say provisionally that it is the fact that you're stuck between your subject relations and society and conventions and this other imperative, this sort of unconditional imperative. That's what leaves you the opening to justice. That's precisely your stuckness, right? So if you went with the absolute, the unconditional, you end up like Lot. Well, take my daughter, right? But if you're in that position of Lot, you're in the position of the question of justice, right there.
sure. But I mean, even for Lot, he is following the laws of hospitality to a certain extent for him at that moment. I mean, I'm not trying to problematize the example.
Oh, right.
It's a great example. But I think he's following God's law for him, you know?
Okay, but, yeah, all right, so, I don't really want to get into a religious conversation, but
Well, no, I don't think we have to.
now I'm really
I
going to
think-
stumble over my words, but let me just say that if you take the religion out of the word God,
Yeah,
right?
yes.
Let's say if we use the word God, small g, after the death of God, right? Then what can God be? Well, for Levinas, it's the interhuman relation, right? But if God is what it is, the absolute, what the imperative, the absolute imperative, and God becomes in the place of the absolute imperative, the law, right? And then you still have, you know, your daughters or whatever, and society. So even Lot, right? Even Lot. Now, you're right that the laws of the land, if he's, in other words, when you say he's still following God's law,
I meant the
there
laws of
has
the
to be,
land.
okay,
I
okay.
meant he was
okay.
following God's laws as his laws, you know, the state, the system, the
Okay,
sociocultural
okay,
union.
okay. Is that right? Was that the law of the?
You're
Of the
supposed.
land.
Well, I know that the moral is that you're supposed to be hospitable, and because the city wasn't, that's why it's destroyed.
Right.
So I think that he was following what he was supposed to do.
By tossing out the daughters, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, maybe that wasn't what. It doesn't say that that's what you had to do to solve it, but that level of hospitality was what was required.
Let's say today, right now, culturally, and this is not unprecedented, as you know, in other cultures. Let's say today, it would be perfectly legal to toss out the daughters. Legal and socially acceptable. Nonetheless, right, there are, okay, this is where Levinas's third party comes in. There are others.
Yeah.
There's never just one other that you owe, and that's where the question of justice is sparked. Because you owe and you owe. Who do you owe more? There's your tension, right? No matter what the law of the land says, no matter what cultural mores say. Right? We're going to talk about that more before we get into cosmopolitanism piece.
Can I say one thing?
Yeah.
The thing is that Lot was another, because he's not where is it? Is it Sodom he's in? He's not a,
Yeah.
it's not a sodomite, but
Yeah, he was a guest.
he is an other in that, so he's not even part of the people around him. So he's already, it's not the law of the land. it's the law of him from where he's, you know what I mean? Like there's another layer on top of it. He is the other of the other in a way.
Very nice.
Nice. Yeah, really nice. Okay, this is where the next page is where we actually began. Let me start at the bottom. Sorry, of 27. This is the last paragraph. Does hospitality consist in interrogating the new arrival? Does it begin with the question addressed to the newcomer, which seems very human and sometimes loving, assuming that hospitality should be linked to love? Blah, blah, blah. So what's your name? What should I call you? Tell me your name. As you would sometimes in a loving way to a kid, a child, he says, what's your name? Or does hospitality begin with the unquestioning welcome in a double effacement, the effacement of the question and the name? Blah, blah, blah. Does one give hospitality to a subject, to an identifiable subject? Or is hospitality rendered, surrendered? Is it given to the other before they are identified, even before they are posited or supposed to be a subject, legal subject or subject nameable by their family name, etc.? Yes, yes. Okay, let's flip one page, and this time I want to pick out something that de Faumontel is asking. On page 30, toward the bottom of that little paragraph, is it really possible to speak of alterity? It's a very interesting question. Whether only spoken or perceived, without thinking being put to the test for an instant by this act. Is it possible to speak of alterity without thinking being put to the test for an instant by this act? Ordinarily, it's not put to the test, not the least little bit. It regally thinks the other, the guest, and moves on to examine another question. Yet sometimes, and Levinas has spoken so well about this, it lets itself lose its bearings. Thinking lets itself lose its bearings in the face of alterity. Even in the face of the idea of alterity. One of the names for this being at a loss in philosophy is astonishment. Could also be translated as wonderment. But astonishment turns us toward that moment when fear yields to being set on the path of familiarity. Discovering other fords along the way, other marks to become accustomed to. Astonishment and then recuperation. Right? Appropriation. Back from the uncanny to the canny. Let's skip over to 43. We talked about this just a bit earlier, but I wanted to point you to it. Down at the bottom, what does foreigner mean? Who is foreign? Who is the foreign man? Who is the foreign woman? What's meant by going abroad, coming from abroad, etc.? These are real questions that he's posing. And then the next page, 45. This is for Nicole. Ethos, ethics, habitat. The idea of bringing together family, bourgeois, or civil society and the state. This is where he's getting to the idea of the power of hospitality, the sovereign power of hospitality. And it's why that's why the connection between hostility and hospitality is, which they seem to contradict each other, and yet. Right, and yet. So he wants to unpack again the meaning of stranger and the very idea, right, of the stranger, of what it can mean, and what's necessary for there to be such a thing as a guest, and the difference between a guest and an enemy, even between a stranger and an enemy. What he's noting down at the bottom of 45, where can I pick this up? It is often, this is toward the bottom, it is often technological, let's say techno-political scientific mutation that obliges us to construct. Really, such mutation itself deconstructs what are claimed as those naturally obvious things or those untouchable axioms. For instance, Greek and Latin we just mentioned. Next page. So we were trying the other day to translate into our hospitality problematic what it is that turns up, what comes our way by email or the internet. What's coming in there?
Porn.
But the very notion, and he does tell us, he reminds us several times that things have always been structured this way. But what he wants to note is the explicit structuration today of the incoming lines. Not just the telephone, but the net, fax, whatever. All the emails coming in, porn, if you will, makes your internal abode already a kind of public space. So, internet, email, I mean everything that these names stand for. Let us first privilege those that completely transform the structure of so-called public space. If the internet, the lines of the internet, are public space, and they go right into your bedroom, and the state has access to public space that goes right into your bedroom, let's say, now we have a little problem. A problem that has always been, but now it's much more explicit. And that's what he's trying to unpack here. You want to leave your home open, as he says, so that you can invite in at any time of the day or night, via email or fax or whatever, anyone you want, from across the street or across the world. And yet, there's a problem when the state pops in. So, one of the things he mentions is when the state in Germany decided to crack down all pornographic sites and therefore banned even, the search term breast. So you can't get to now breast cancer research on the web because there's a crackdown on porn. So now the state is in your house. You can't access. It's opened up in a way that has always been, but it's never so explicit as today.
But that's not to say the state was there already, just with different laws, but different things.
That's what I mean. It's just always been structured this way.
Yeah, just a new layer.
Now it's very explicit, straight into from a line you usually install right into your house, right? Always been. I mean, he says it over and over. Things have always been structured this way. This is not something that the internet did. It did not change structure. It did make something much more explicit. You're not happy with that? Go ahead.
Well, I just feel I think you're, with the internet, I realize it's kind of a minor point. You're kind of mischaracterizing it, because it's really something that you're tapping into a remote computer and saying, oh, I want to check this information, or I want to communicate by video chat with somebody. And I realize it can go right into your bedroom, but it's not really the same thing as a telephone line where it's like,
Why not?
well,
Download, upload, you actually receive information.
well, I understand, but
Well, it says at the bottom of 47, nowadays, a reflection on hospitality presupposes among other things, the possibility of a rigorous delimitation of thresholds or frontiers between the familial and the non-familiar, between the foreign and the non-foreign, the citizen and the non-citizen, but first of all, between the private and the public, private and public law, etc. And then it kind of goes on to, you know, to say, I mean, that the way of thinking hospitality that he's asking us to occupy suggests that, on the one hand, even as we're constructing that rigorous delimitation, we're doing so on the basis of it both never actually having been there, there never having been the state not in the house, and also, more than ever, it being impossible to keep out whatever should be on the outside of the boundary.
This is what we were going to read next, and possibly helpful if you pick up a few more lines here. The distinction between private mail in the classic form, the letter, the postcard, etc. It has to circulate without control. They're not supposed to open your mail. But what happens every day now? It seems like every day somebody has stupidly had an affair and talked about it on email, and then what happens? The courts get their email and then use them against them in the courts, right? So that now, you know, the partner who didn't cheat gets all the money or the house or whatever, right? So your email is not private. But how many of you send letters anymore? Do you send letters?
Sometimes.
Yeah, right, all right.
But is this only a relationship? It doesn't seem like it is. I feel like the state has always been involved at some level with breeding prohibitions and spermatic economies and taboos on masturbation, all these kinds of, you know, intriguing insertions and problematizations of, it's ultimately a very boring, typical, we had an affair, it's not the first person had an affair, it's very boring.
But Nick, this is exactly what he's saying,
Yeah.
right? It's always been there. That's exactly what he's saying. It's always been there. Now, however, it's in your face. You can't believe, like when you send a letter, you see it, and you have a sense that it's going. And it's between you. It's their state. It's not the state's business. The state can't open it. In fact, there are laws that say they shouldn't and all this. Now, there's not even the facade. I mean, they always could, and they probably did. And if you had the slightest bit, if you looked slightly suspicious, they were opening it, right? Now, very simple, right? So now the facade is gone. What he's saying here is that, okay, let's read this again. Nowadays, a reflection on hospitality presupposes, among other things, the possibility of a rigorous delimitation of thresholds or frontiers. It presupposes that. To be able to talk about hospitality, you have to presume there's a difference between public and private to begin the conversation. If everything were public, there would be no hospitality. No one would have sovereignty over a space to say, yeah, come on in, right? You have to presuppose a delimitation of frontiers to talk about hospitality, okay?
And a rigorous delimitation.
A
Right, I mean,
rigorous
that's the
delimitation.
nowadays part, right? Is that we imagine, I mean, modernity is constructed in part on the notion of a rigorous
Yes,
distinction between public and private,
right,
where what's mine is now really mine, the liberty of the moderns of Benjamin Constant.
right. Between foreign and non-foreign, citizen and non-citizen, but first of all, between public and private and public law, etc. In principle, private mail in the classic form, the letter, the postcard, had to circulate without control within a country or from one country to another. It must be neither read nor intercepted. In principle. The same is true in principle for the phone, the fax, email, and naturally the internet. In principle. Censorship, telephone tapping, interceptions, in principle, represent either crimes or acts authorized only for reasons of a state responsible for the integrity of the territory, for sovereignty, for security, and national defense. So, what happens when a state intervenes not only for surveillance, but to ban private communications? Just so simple now. So simple. What happens when the state intervenes to ban private on the pretext that they are pornographic, which up to now hasn't been a danger to public security or the integrity of national territory. Well, let's just keep going. I assume, without knowing enough about it, that the argument by which this state intervention claims to be justified is the allegation that the space of the internet is in fact not private, but public, and above all has a public accessibility, nationally or internationally, greatly exceeding in its usage, in its resources, that of porn links by phone or video network, and even more greatly exceeding the readership of Sod, etc., 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 other banned books. At any rate, what's at issue, and is by the same token deranged, deformed, is once again the trace of a frontier between the public and the non-public, between public or political space and individual or family or familial home. In other words, what we need to presume before even beginning to talk about hospitality is a rigorous frontier between public and private, at the very least. And then what does he say at the end? What we have is no capacity. What we lack is the trace of a frontier between the public and the non-public, public or political space, and the individual or familial home. There's one of the huge problems of talking about hospitality, even beginning to try to talk about hospitality. Let's just keep going for a minute. From the moment when a public authority, a state, this or that state power, gives itself or is recognized as having the right to control, monitor, ban exchanges that those doing the exchanging deem private, but that the state can intercept since these private exchanges cross public space and become available there, then every element of hospitality gets disrupted. My at-home was also constituted by the field of access via my telephone line, through which I can give my time, my word, my friendship, my love, my help to whomever I wish, and so invite whomever I wish to come into my home, first into my ear, when I wish, at any time of the day or night, whether the other is my across-the-fence neighbor or fellow citizen, any other friend or person I don't know at the other end of the world. Now, if my home, the very one constituted by the threshold that allows me to invite someone in whenever I want, now if my home, in principle, inviolable, is also constituted in a more and more essential interior way by my phone line, but also by my email, but also by my fax, but also by my access to the internet, then the intervention of the state becomes a violation of the inviolable. In the place where inviolable immunity remains the condition of hospitality. How can I give hospitality without a home? My home, over which I have sovereign power, without a home to offer. '53. Just a few lines in. All these techno-scientific possibilities threaten the integrity of home. We are no longer at home. And really the very integrity of the self, of obscenity. Inside-outside collapse, public-private collapse. Skip down just a bit. Whenever the home is violated, wherever at any rate violation is felt as such, you can foresee a privatizing and even a familialist reaction by widening the ethnocentric and nationalist and thus xenophobic circle. Not directed against the foreigner as such, but paradoxically against the anonymous technological power, foreign to the language or the religion as much as the family and the nation, which threatens with the home the traditional conditions of hospitality. The perversion and pervertibility of this law, which is also the law of hospitality, is that one can become virtually xenophobic in order to protect or claim to protect one's own hospitality, the own home that makes possible one's own hospitality. The more you feel threatened in your capacity to be a host, the more you close down and become inhospitable to protect your power to be hospitable. People are getting up to pee. I need to stop. You have a little bit longer? Okay. Do you want to say anything about this? You want to intervene? Okay.
I mean, does this statement presuppose a kind of flattening that makes it a little trickier? I mean, it makes sense only if, we've got two houses on opposite sides of the border, and people going back and forth and being hospitable to each other, they lose the sovereignty of their space, the state intervenes, these kinds of things becomes a problem. But we're presuming that, person A visits person B and person B visits person A. What happens when, people, well, the explicit way, but now it's tricky, but do Europeans go to Africa as often as Africans go to Europe? I mean, it's kind of, I think it again returns to that Algerian question, right?
I'm not following you. What are you talking about? Start again.
I mean, it's hard to articulate, the loss of sovereignty and the home spurs these ethnocentric and nationalist tendencies in this xenophobic circle, right? So, I mean, are we presuming that these xenophobic circles are equal, or that this breakdown in hospitality, occurs on both sides of the border, or more often one side of the border or the other? That's maybe a quick way I can ask the question.
What border?
Any border. I mean, but the border between, self and other, between the visitor and, between the person whose home it is, the host and the guest. Does that make sense?
I think it has to do a lot with the feeling of threatening, the feeling of that sovereignty being threatened that he's talking about.
That's what he says.
Yeah, and I guess it would depend on which side of this relation that that the threatened feeling would come. I mean, I guess he would I think always or usually affect the host more so than the guest. The host's sovereignty is always kind of the one that's under attack. Which I think,
What else could it, how else could it be, right?
Right.
And again, it's the felt sovereignty, which is not, right? We've already indicated that there's no such thing. But there is the sense of it.
Right, well, and this
Right.
whole notion of like the facade, I
Right.
love to use that word, the facade of private space.
Right.
That every time we send a letter, it's like we imagine that like
Exactly.
closing up a little bit of me and like what's going out there. But the same thing happens all the way back to the level of the individual, like I am here, when someone walks this close to me, like that's
Right. Invasion of your space.
yeah.
You gonna say something about that?
Well, it seemed like the way you're putting the question, maybe I wasn't following you, but it seemed like it's kind of supposing a reciprocity in hospitality, and at least on my reading, it's less that there's you and there's me, and we have this sort of exchange relation, because at that point we're already in a system of law, right? That's hospitality according to the laws, or hospitality by right. Whereas I have a kind of an infinite obligation. That's part of my coming to be. That's for me anyways, the hospitality, the law. And so then the very real questions of like frontiers and sort of reciprocal or non-reciprocal exchanges are all happening at a level above or after or subsequent to the, for me at least, refusal of a refusal to be hospitable in the face of my feeling my hospitability threatened. So I'm talking with my partner, and there's that great Billy Joel song, "The Stranger," right? You're not feeling me in that, David?
I don't know, I thought it was an Elton John.
Billy Joel. Well, so
I'm with you, Art.
you would, okay. It's a great song. Thank you.
Phenomenal.
So the song says, it's about song.
You promised us a song.
I promised you a song.
Maybe you're hospitable
Be
about
true to
it.
your text. Stand by your text.
Okay, I'll stand by my text. So, it's then the stranger kicks you right between the eyes. The song's about intimate relations and the emergence of the stranger in one's lover. And then the response to that one's supposed to occupy, identifying with Billy Joel's persona, is don't be scared to try again. You should know by now, something. Haven't you ever seen the stranger in yourself? And then the idea being, speaking to something Alexandra was saying earlier, that I'm also the alterity. I'm also the stranger to myself. And so when I'm having a conversation with my partner, and there's suddenly this moment that puts me in question, that her sudden alterity, her not being who the fuck she's supposed to be.
For you.
For me, you're right, supposed to be. I mean, I don't mean like in some God-given way. I mean just relative to what constitutes my sense of reality.
Okay.
Then puts me in question. Who am I? And the simplest, and I think this is for me what Derrida is pointing to, the simplest, most automatic response is to close the borders, to try harder to more firmly demarcate the boundaries of myself.
Absolutely.
Or of my house, or of my nation, or of my whatever. Even though that was a flawed enterprise from the very beginning, and all that's really been shown is something that was always there.
Yeah, but what I'm interested, looking at the text, is how talking about this privatizing reaction to that alterity is that it's not directed against the foreigner as such, but paradoxically against the anonymous technological power. And I'm slightly not understanding that, because
Is that the call to tighten up your privacy? It's not because of the foreigner itself, but because of the technological power that invaded your privacy. No?
Keep talking. He says,
Not sure of anything else.
yeah,
Which passage is that again?
that's now become the standard.
Yeah.
You gotta have
It's
something.
on the website.
Not directed against the foreigner as such.
Which page is that again? I forget.
53,
Yeah.
right in the middle. But paradoxically against the anonymous technological power, forms of the language, the religion, the family, the nation, which threatens with the home the traditional conditions of hospitality. What's the anonymous technological power? Well, okay.
I guess with internet, like you open a window
What do you open it to?
to public, to
Okay.
the outside, yeah.
Okay,
And then
okay.
Or the state.
If you suddenly feel too much invaded, then
Yeah, you shut it down.
you should.
You don't just shut it, you double check to make sure that the latch is on every time you leave the house.
You get an alarm. By the way, my husband set off the alarm yesterday. He called me and goes, "Oh God, what's the code? The cops are coming," because they called.
Yeah.
And he didn't know the code. So he was like, "Oh," and they said, "Uh-huh. All right, thank you." No. Anyway, the anonymous technological power. I don't want to leave this. What would be the anonymous technological power that I began to, let's see. Okay, back up. Whenever the home is violated, what's it violated by? In this context, what's it talking about?
The parasite.
Well, what's the parasite in this sense?
Absolute other?
The state.
State,
The
yeah.
state, right? Whenever the home is violated, in the context right here, on these pages, wherever, at any rate, a violation is felt as such, you can foresee a privatizing and even a familialist reaction by widening the ethnocentric and nationalist and thus xenophobic circle. Not directed against the foreigner as such, but paradoxically against the anonymous technological power, right? And part of what is felt as the anonymous technological power is the state that comes in through your openings. But it's not synonymous with the state. It's felt as an anonymous technological power. But the problem is that the state is, and he goes on to talk about this, the state doesn't have the power, and that's why they're doing the same thing, scrambling to shut down a power, an anonymous technological power, that in fact they don't have a hold of anymore.
Yeah.
So let's just close all the potential searches that might have anything to do with porn, right? Or now they're involved. So in other words, he's not just talking about you, he's talking about the state as well.
So like shutting the internet down during revolution.
Yes, yes. The state control becomes less and less possible, and more possible at the same time. It's a paradox, right? But there's a more and more of a scramble to control, precisely because it feels out of control. And that's what he's about to get to.
Yeah.
All right. Maybe we should go there.
Can I ask a question
Yeah.
that's still with Rosemary's question? Because I wasn't, so it's directed against the anonymous technological power. Are we being asked to see that as a displacement? Then, so it's because it is an ethnocentric and nationalist reaction. So are we being asked to see what is properly a reaction to this anonymous technological power being displaced and expressed via xenophobia? So that in the era of sort of increased invasion of the home by sort of this state, and then even sort of more extremely corporate. I mean, I think of advertising, the ubiquity of advertising on the internet.
Yeah, I think one I think legitimate way to read this is that the more you feel threatened, the more your sovereignty over self and home feels threatened, the more xenophobic, nationalistic, familialist you become, right? It has its repercussions. Even if what's invading is not some other nation, not the other, right, in any sense that you're thinking, but you feel invaded, then that's the response, right? But we see that all the time, right? We see that all the time.
See, in Europe, they're questioning the Schengen space
Yeah.
again, like Denmark wanted to.
Questioning what space?
Schengen.
Yeah.
We have
The
open
border
frontiers.
agreements,
Open borders.
once you get one
Open
shut.
borders. Denmark wanted to close the border again. France and Italy temporarily closed the borders because of the immigrants from North Africa.
Yeah, the more you feel as if someone you didn't invite comes in anyway, the more you tighten, the more you close down, and don't invite, right? So that perception of losing control and sovereignty over your very possibility for hospitality makes you respond inhospitably.
So is this in a sense, really a very, very concrete point to this, in this particular moment, so that in the sort of era of all pervasive technology, or all pervasive, externally controlled information systems, that would then necessarily, via this kind of displacement, become the era of radical intensification of xenophobias and nationalisms and ethnocentrisms?
Well, I think we're seeing it, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Seeing it. The more open communications become, the more borders get overflown, the more there's a crackdown on borders. Right? I mean, that's just, you just gonna look around, right, and find all kinds of examples of that, right? Because what are borders? They're made up. They don't exist except conventionally, right? And so that's why you keep having to nail them down, right? When they're threatened.
I guess, but then if I'm understanding this, that suggests that there's a kind of a preferential doubling with regard to geopolitical borders. So that there's two different, I mean, really massively different kinds of borders. There's the borders that are being invaded by this anonymous technological presence that I'm reacting against. But instead of reacting against that anonymous technological presence, I'm reacting against that presence also on the increasingly open
Yes.
geopolitical borders, so that bears then the brunt of the entire process.
It's a way of responding to the felt threat, right?
Whereas maybe if you just take the computer out of the house, it might be better.
But you understand that this is only the contemporary expression of an age-old problem, right? It's just, that's what he's trying, that's why he keeps saying, this is not new. This is the way it's being expressed today. In an in-your-face way, perhaps, much more in your face than it maybe was before, but it's never not been this problem, right?
Yeah.
Because you were never, I mean, the home was never inviolable. And your power as a host, whether you have the internet or not, was never inviolable. The very fact that you can, and that there's an opening to invite in, means it's a threat, right? It already means it.
I'm just thinking of, this doesn't necessarily need to be said, but walled cities and having to have markets in the walled cities. There's always been, that's just the example.
Right.
Also bomb shelters.
Yeah, that's right. That's nice. That's nice, yeah.
But he is saying that the conditions of hospitality are threatened. So there is some way in which he's saying it is different, perhaps. than
What is
No, I think it's
today.
It's always been threatened, but it's become more
Yeah.
pronounced.
I think the feeling, this is the important part. I mean, the shift in conventions is what, because you think about like a paranoid schizophrenic, like, 1,500 years ago, shutting himself off from the world, like closing all of his like individual borders. And for him, the threat of people, the threat of the outside, is just the same as the threat of pornography through your computer.
I just have to say this. So, a fascinating angle on that. You must read the telephone book. You must read the telephone book. It's part of your assigned reading for after the class. Because paranoid schizophrenics actually helped Alexander Graham Bell with the conception of the telephone, coming in, describing the transistors and the communications that are coming in.
Well,
Read the telephone book. Let's take a break.